Sarah Mason had always believed that life's twists and turns were meant to be savored, even when they led down paths she never imagined she'd walk. Born and raised in a small town in Georgia, Sarah was a bright and beautiful girl who caught the eye of many. But it was Thomas who captured her heart. He was charming, attentive, and just a few years older, giving him an air of maturity that Sarah found irresistible. They married when she was just 17, full of dreams and the naive belief that love alone could conquer anything. The early years of their marriage were a whirlwind. Thomas was everything Sarah thought she wanted: steady, reliable, and seemingly devoted. They bought a small house on the outskirts of town, where Sarah decorated each room with care, envisioning the children they would one day have. But as the months turned into years, something dark and unspoken crept into their marriage. Thomas became distant, often leaving for business trips that Sarah never questioned. She chalked up his coldness to the pressures of work and tried her best to be the perfect wife, even as loneliness began to gnaw at her. By the time Sarah turned 25, the marriage had become a hollow shell. The man who had once been her everything now felt like a stranger. The distance between them had grown insurmountable, and the love they once shared was nothing more than a faded memory. When Thomas suggested a divorce, Sarah didn't argue. She signed the papers and walked away, thinking she had left the darkness behind. Life moved on. Sarah remarried a few years later, this time to Mark, a kind and gentle man who adored her. Together, they had two beautiful children, Emily and Jake. For the first time in years, Sarah felt like she had found true happiness. Her life was simple but fulfilling: school runs, soccer games, family vacations. The scars from her first marriage faded, replaced by the warmth of her new life. 5 years into her second marriage, the last thing Sarah expected was a knock on the door that would unravel everything she thought she knew. It was a crisp autumn morning, and Sarah was busy preparing breakfast when she heard the knock. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and opened the door to find two men in dark suits standing on her porch. "Mrs. Mason?" one of them asked, flashing a badge. "We're with the FBI. We need to speak with you about your first husband, Thomas." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Thomas? What about him? May we come in?" the other agent asked, his tone grave. She stepped aside, allowing them into the living room. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together why the FBI would be interested in Thomas. The agents sat down on the couch, their expressions unreadable. "Mrs. Mason," the first agent began, "we're sorry to inform you that your ex-husband, Thomas Richardson, is currently under investigation for a series of murders." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "Murders?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The agent nodded. "We believe he may be responsible for the deaths of several young women, some of whom disappeared while you were still married to him." Sarah felt the room spin. She gripped the edge of the coffee table to steady herself. This must be some mistake. Thomas was. He was distant, but he wasn't a killer. "We understand this is difficult to hear," the agent said gently, "but the evidence we've gathered is overwhelming. We believe he's been killing for years, even before your marriage, and continued long after your divorce." Sarah's mind reeled. She thought back to the unexplained absences, the coldness that had crept into their marriage. How could she have been so blind? The idea that she had shared a bed with the monster, that she had loved him, was almost too much to bear. As the agents continued to speak, Sarah learned more than she ever wanted to know. Thomas had been under investigation for months, ever since a cold case was reopened when new DNA evidence linked him to a murder committed 2 decades ago. The more they dug, the more they uncovered a trail of bodies stretching back years, each one with ties to Thomas. The most chilling revelation came when the agents showed her a photograph. It was of a young woman, her face hauntingly familiar. "This is one of the victims," the agent explained. "We believe she was killed while you were still married to Thomas." Sarah stared at the photo, her stomach twisting in horror. She recognized the woman as someone Thomas had mentioned in passing, a friend from work. The thought that she had unknowingly been so close to one of his victims made her feel sick. The agents asked her countless questions about their marriage, his behavior, any strange incidents she could recall. Sarah answered as best as she could, though her mind was clouded with shock. They assured her that she was not under suspicion, but the investigation would require her cooperation moving forward. After they left, Sarah sat alone in the living room, the weight of the news pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. She looked around at the life she had built, the family photos on the wall, the toys scattered across the floor, and felt a surge of anger. How dare he invade her life like this, even after all these years? Over the next few weeks, Sarah's world was turned upside down. The media caught wind of the story, and soon her quiet neighborhood was swarming with reporters. Friends and neighbors began to whisper behind her back, some offering sympathy while others distanced themselves. Mark tried his best to support her, but even he struggled to understand the depth of her pain. As the investigation progressed, more details emerged about Thomas's double life. He had been a master of deception, leading a seemingly normal existence while hiding his dark urges. The FBI uncovered journals where he had meticulously documented his crimes, describing in chilling detail how he selected and murdered his victims. It became clear that Thomas had been a predator long before Sarah had met him, and that their marriage had been just another mask he were to blend into society. The hardest part for Sarah was the realization that she had been living in a lie. She had spent years trying to move on from the pain of her first marriage, only to discover that the man she thought she knew had been a monster. The memories she had cherished, the early days of their relationship, the moments when she had truly believed they were in love, were now tainted by the knowledge of what he had done. But even as the truth threatened to consume her, Sarah refused to let it define her. She knew she had to be strong, not just for herself, but for her children. She threw herself into her role as a mother, determined to shield Emily and Jake from the chaos that had erupted around them. She sought therapy, trying to come to terms with the trauma she had endured, and slowly began to rebuild her sense of self. As the years passed, the story of Thomas Richardson faded from the headlines, replaced by new scandals and tragedies. Sarah's life gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy, though she knew she would never be the same. The scars left by her first marriage would always be there, but they no longer defined her. She had survived, and in doing so, had found a strength she never knew she possessed. 20 years after that fateful knock on the door, Sarah stood in her garden, watching as her grandchildren played among the flowers. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the scene. Mark came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You okay?" he asked, kissing the top of her head. Sarah smiled, leaning into him. "I am. For the first time in a long time, really am." As they stood there, surrounded by the simple beauty of their life, Sarah knew that she had finally put the ghosts of her past to rest. The man who had once haunted her was gone, buried by the weight of his own sins. She had emerged from the darkness, stronger and more resilient than ever before, ready to embrace the light of the life. She had built a life defined not by the horrors of the past, but by the love and happiness of the present. As Sarah read through the journal, her heart began to race. The woman described meeting a charming man named Thomas, whom she believed to be her soulmate. The entries grew darker over time, detailing how Thomas became increasingly controlling and abusive, isolating her from her friends and family. The final entry was a desperate plea for help, as the woman feared for her life. Sarah's hands trembled as she closed the journal. She realized that the woman's story mirrored her own in many ways, though she had escaped before it reached such a terrifying conclusion. The woman had disappeared shortly after that final entry, never to be seen again. One of Thomas's many victims, Sarah realized with horror. This discovery brought everything rushing back. The grief, the anger, and the guilt she thought she had buried resurfaced with a vengeance. How had she never known? How had she never suspected that Thomas was capable of such evil? The questions gnawed at her, but she knew there were no answers that could bring peace. Sarah decided to bring the journal to the authorities, hoping it might provide some closure for the family of the woman who had written it. The FBI reopened the case, confirming that the journal belonged to one of Thomas's earliest victims, a woman who had been missing for over 30 years. Thanks to Sarah's discovery, they were able to finally connect her disappearance to Thomas's crimes, offering a sliver of justice to those left behind. In the days that followed, Sarah found herself grappling with a new wave of emotions. The journal was a stark reminder that the past, no matter how deeply buried, had a way of resurfacing when least expected. But this time, Sarah refused to let it consume her. Instead, she chose to honor the woman whose voice had been silenced for so long. She spoke at a memorial service for the victim, her words a tribute to the strength and resilience of all the women who had suffered at Thomas's hands. Sarah's speech was filled with the quiet determination, a vow that she would never let his darkness define her or the memory of those he had harmed. The event was cathartic, not just for Sarah, but for everyone who had been touched by the tragedy. In sharing her story, Sarah found a renewed sense of purpose. She began volunteering with organizations that supported victims of domestic abuse, using her own experiences to help others break free from the chains of their past. Years passed, and Sarah's life continued to flourish. She became a beloved figure in her community, known for her compassion and strength. Her family grew, with Emily and Jake each starting families of their own. The scars of the past, while still there, had faded into the background, replaced by the love and joy of her present life. On the 20th anniversary of the day the FBI had shown up at her door, Sarah visited Thomas in prison. It was something she had vowed never to do, but she felt it was time to face him one last time. She needed to see the man who had once been her husband, to confront the monster she had once loved. Thomas was a shadow of the man she had known, older, frailer, but the coldness in his eyes was still there. They sat across from each other in the stark, sterile visitation room, a wall of glass separating them. "Why?" Sarah asked, her voice steady. Thomas looked at her with a twisted smile. "Why not?" It was all he said, but it was enough. There were no apologies, no explanations that would ever make sense. For Thomas, it had never been about the why, only the how. And in that moment, Sarah realized that she would never get the closure she had once sought from him. The man sitting across from her was not worth her time or energy. She stood up, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "Goodbye, Thomas." As she walked out of the prison, Sarah felt a sense of finality. The ghosts of her past had been laid to rest. She had faced them, acknowledged their existence, and now, she was finally free. Sarah returned home to her family, where the love and warmth of those who truly mattered embraced her. She knew that life would continue to throw challenges her way, but she was ready for whatever came next. The past was behind her, and the future, with all its uncertainties, was something she now welcomed with open arms. In the end, Sarah Mason was more than a survivor. She was a woman who had faced the darkest corners of her past and emerged into the light, stronger and more determined than ever to live her life on her own terms, free from the shadows that once haunted her.